China finished the railway 3 years ahead of schedule. And when you see where it ends, you'll understand why New Delhi went quiet. This line doesn't just move passengers. It moves military hardware, fuel, and equipment to an altitude where most engines stall and most soldiers struggle to breathe. It crosses the roof of the world and stops less than 100 miles from one of the most contested borders on the planet. That border belongs to India. Here's what this railway actually is, what it cost to build, and why the country on the other side of that mountain range is watching every kilometer of new track with something closer to alarm than curiosity. The Sichuan-Tibet Railway is not finished yet, but large sections of it are already operating, and the construction pace is unlike anything attempted in this kind of terrain before. The full route stretches roughly 1,800 kilometers from Chengdu to Lhasa, crossing some of the most hostile geography on Earth. The elevation changes alone would disqualify most civil engineering teams from even tendering for the project. Along portions of the route, the line climbs above 4,500 meters. To put that number in your body, that's higher than the peak of Mont Blanc, the tallest mountain in the Alps. At that altitude, unacclimatized workers have around 30% less oxygen in every breath. Normal construction equipment loses efficiency. Diesel engines need retuning. Steel contracts and expands at ranges that would crack ordinary wells. China solved this, not by working around the terrain, but by going through it. More than 80% of the route runs through tunnels or across bridges. The tunnels alone account for hundreds of kilometers of excavation through permafrost, unstable granite, and active seismic zones. One tunnel stretches longer than the entire Channel Tunnel connecting England and France. And workers board it from multiple directions simultaneously, meeting in the middle with tolerances measured in centimeters. But here's the twist. The engineering story is only half the reason this railway exists. The first section of this line, the Qinghai-Tibet Railway, opened in 2006. At the time, it was already the world's highest railway, crossing the Tanggula Pass at over 5,000 meters. That line connected Lhasa to the rest of China for the first time by rail and reduced the cost and time to move goods and people into Tibet by an order of magnitude. Logistics that once took weeks by road now took days by rail. What the Sichuan-Tibet extension does is fundamentally different in character. It doesn't just improve access to Lhasa. It opens an entirely new corridor through the eastern part of the Tibetan Plateau, one that bypasses the more exposed northern route and reaches deeper into the southwestern corner of China's territory. That southwestern corner is where the terrain begins to slope toward India. Stay for that, because this is the part that rarely makes it into the headlines. The Himalayan border between China and India has never been formally agreed. Two nuclear powers, a combined population of nearly 3 billion people, and the boundary between them is still a line each side draws differently. They've fought over it before. In 1962, a brief and brutal war established a status quo that neither side has ever fully accepted. Since then, there have been standoffs, skirmishes, and in 2020, a clash in the Galwan Valley that killed soldiers on both sides and pushed the two countries closer to open conflict than they'd been in decades. India's strategic problem has always been geography. Getting soldiers and supplies to the border areas is slow, costly, and dependent on mountain roads that ice over, wash out, and narrow to single-lane tracks at the worst moments. China has spent the past 2 decades solving the exact same problem from its side of the mountains and solving it faster. The railway is the clearest expression of that, a line that can move freight at 160 kilometers per hour through tunnels that bypass the weather entirely changes the logistics equation completely. It's not about tourism or economic development alone, though both are cited in every official statement. It's about the ability to reinforce a position, supply a forward base, and sustain operations at altitude without depending on helicopters and convoys. Trains don't get altitude sickness. Trains don't need acclimatization time. And a train carrying armored vehicles, fuel, and rations doesn't care what the temperature is at 5,000 meters because it never comes above ground. This is what India's defense planners have been reading in the construction progress reports. Not a tourism line, a logistics spine. And it gets crazier. Because the railway is only one piece of a much larger infrastructure push that China has been running in Tibet and the surrounding provinces for the better part of 20 years. In that same period, China has built or upgraded more than 90,000 kilometers of roads across the Tibetan Plateau and western provinces. It has constructed a network of air bases at altitude. It has expanded towns, power grids, and fiber infrastructure in regions that a generation ago had almost none. The total capital investment in Western China's infrastructure over the past 2 decades runs into the hundreds of billions of dollars. The railway's $20 billion price tag is significant on its own, but it sits inside a spending program that dwarfs it by a factor of 10. For context, that's not a number India can easily match in the same time frame. India's border infrastructure investment has accelerated significantly since 2017, and the government has approved projects with a sense of urgency that was missing before. New roads, tunnels, and bridges have been pushed through on the Indian side of the disputed territory. The Border Roads Organization has beaten its own records for construction pace in several recent years. But the head start is real, and the terrain on India's side of the line is no easier to work with. Here's the part almost nobody talks about. It's not just the physical infrastructure. It's what that infrastructure enables next. When you can move things fast and reliably into a remote region, that region stops being remote in the operational sense. It becomes, in military planning language, a sustained theater. You can stockpile, you can rotate forces without exhausting them. You can respond to an incident in hours rather than days. The altitude disadvantage, which historically favored whoever was already there, starts to erode when one side can keep refreshing its position and the other is still dependent on road convoys that take 3 days from the nearest railhead. India's military has adapted its own doctrine in response. Mountain Strike Corps formations designed specifically for Himalayan operations have been reorganized and strengthened. Forward bases have been supplied and pre-stocked with greater depth than before. The logic on both sides is the same. The side that can sustain the most force at the highest altitude for the longest time at acceptable cost wins the strategic standoff without ever firing a shot. The railway is China's most visible answer to that equation. But there's a second thing happening alongside the military and strategic calculus, and it matters for understanding the full weight of what's being built here. The Sichuan-Tibet Railway is also a statement about economic integration. The western provinces of China generate a fraction of the GDP per capita of the coastal cities. Connecting them to the high-speed rail network that already links Shanghai, Beijing, and Chengdu isn't just a security project. It's a development project, and the two goals reinforce each other in ways that are difficult to separate. When freight from Lhasa can reach Chengdu in hours instead of days, agricultural goods, minerals, and manufactured products all become viable exports. Local economies begin to integrate with national supply chains. Population centers that were once difficult to hold from a governance standpoint become easier to administer, easier to supply, and easier to monitor. Infrastructure has always been one of the most effective tools of centralized control over a periphery, and this railway is no exception to that pattern. India watches all of this with the understanding that a more integrated, more developed, and more logistically capable Tibet changes the strategic balance in the Himalayas in ways that no amount of diplomatic protest can reverse. Once the tunnels are bored, once the bridges are poured, once the trains are running, the map has changed. And maps, once changed by concrete, tend to stay changed. The projected completion date for the full Chengdu to Lhasa route varies depending on the section. Some estimates put final completion in the early 2030s. At current construction pace, those estimates have been revised forward more than once. The Yan to Linji section, which covers the most technically demanding terrain of the entire route, is where the bulk of the remaining tunneling and bridge work is concentrated. Getting through that section will require boring through rock formations that geologists describe as among the most complex on the planet. Highly fractured granite with unpredictable groundwater and a seismic profile that means the construction teams are essentially building inside a slow-motion earthquake. They are still building. That pace matters because each completed section activates the logistics advantage on an incremental basis. You don't have to wait for the whole line to be finished before it changes what's possible. Every tunnel that opens, every bridge that carries its first test load, adds another link in a chain that runs from the Chinese interior to the edge of the Himalayas. India's response has been to accelerate its own program on the other side of those mountains. The Zojila Tunnel, one of the highest road tunnels in the world, is now operational and keeps a critical route open through winter for the first time. The Adel Tunnel through the Rotang Pass changed logistics for the Lahal and Spiti valleys permanently. Several railway feasibility studies for Himalayan routes into Ladakh and Arunachal Pradesh are at advanced stages. India is building too. The gap is the question, and the gap is real. What you're watching, measured in tunnels and track and bridge pylons poured at 4,000 meters, is the physical expression of a rivalry that will define the Asian century. Not a Cold War conducted in ideology. A construction race conducted in concrete, steel, and altitude. The country that can move more, faster, higher, at lower cost, will shape what the border between the world's two most populous nations actually means in practice for the next 50 years. $20 billion buys a lot of tunnels. But what it really buys is the ability to make the impossible edge of the map feel like the accessible middle of the country. China has done that once already with the Sichuan-Tibet line. It is doing it again, closer to the border, with a line that is faster, more capable, and built for a world in which the Himalayas are no longer the natural barrier they once were. The mountain range hasn't moved, but the point where supply lines stop has. That's the story the $20 billion is actually telling. And if you want to see what the rest of the world is building next, this is the place to be.